Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about writing for designers. Today on the show, I am joined by the writer and educator Leslie Roberts. I was introduced to Leslie through the recent podcast guest Mary Banis, who teaches with Leslie at the California College of Arts in San Francisco. Leslie is the chair of the graduate writing program there at CCA, and many of her classes are about teaching writing to designers of all types. Over the last few years, I've talked to a lot of designers who are also writers, or designers who are also teaching, and designers who are teaching writing. But I don't think I've talked to a writer who comes from outside of the design world, yet finds themselves teaching writing to designers. And Leslie seemed like the perfect person to do that. And so I was really interested in talking to her about all of this and about this relationship between design and writing, and how she thinks about that as somebody who's coming to it from a writing perspective instead of a design perspective. We also talk about her early love of writing and reading, her time as a journalist, and why she decided to leave that career to get an MFA. We also talk about her research around ideas of ecologies and her thinking on nature and the environment. This is a really wide-ranging conversation, and one that I think you'll really, really enjoy. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism, as well as a preview of the upcoming episode. Scratching the Surface is 100% supported through these memberships. So if you like the show, if you want to see it continue, if you want to help out with its ongoing production, I hope that you would consider joining. All you have to do is go to scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Leslie Roberts. Your background to kind of set the stage for how you got to do the work that you're doing now, and kind of how you think about the work that you're doing now. And so I saw that you originally got a BFA in political science, and I'm curious about that. What were you interested in when you were a 18, 19-year-old studying political science?
When I was a 19-year-old political science student at the University of Michigan. So my father, who just died in August, his name was Edwin A. Roberts Jr. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning opinion maker, and he did not attend college. He had gone to college for a year and then left to go home and support his family. And he was a huge proponent of a college education. He was an autodidact. And he was also very much of the mindset that if you went to a place like the University of Michigan, you did not study writing or English. You studied in subject areas that would give you what he called mental capital. And so I was strongly encouraged to study economics and political science. And so I did. And I have never regretted that choice, because I'm a huge reader on my own. And I've always been a reader. So I think the advice that he gave that young me was really excellent advice, because when you study political science, you are taught how to think about things from sort of a numeric point of view, but also from the idea that there are ways you can evaluate how groups of people are thinking, extrapolated from smaller groups that you study. And so the people I worked with at Michigan were doing fascinating field work where they were trying to understand things. So Michigan had a very famous center where the fellow Arthur Miller, who created the exit poll, was teaching there when I was there. And they had a very interesting faculty that did a lot of field work where they would do things like look at groups of miners in West Virginia to see how their home and educational environment affected their political standpoint. And then they'd compare it with an equivalent group of miners in Chile. And so I saw people trying to create and generate knowledge in very fascinating ways. And at the time, you're young, I was young, so I wasn't really thinking about it so much. But as the years have gone by, I've thought more about how do we know how people think? And I guess that's what I got
Mhm.
from the study of political science. How do we theoretically and in a very rigorous way understand how people are thinking and making decisions?
So you said you were always a reader and a writer, and that your father thought that you should study something else besides writing. Can you talk about that interest in writing? Where did that come from? What kind of writing were you interested in when you were a child?
Yeah, so I made my first book when I was 8 years old, and I I still have it, and it was a story.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was, and I illustrated it as well. And it was the title is Princess Dawn and the Black Knight. So my 8 year old mind was preoccupied with princesses and rescues and things of that nature. I
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't know exactly why some people feel the need to write their thoughts down, but it was an instinct that I would just say was innate in me, and probably very much
Mm-hmm.
cultivated by growing up in a home where my father's work was about writing, and he spoke about writing, and he wrote from a studio at our house. So writing was
Mm-hmm.
active practice in my home, and so it just seemed organic to be doing writing, that I didn't know that that wasn't something everybody did. It was only much later that
Right. Oh, that's interesting.
yeah, it was only much later that I came to see, like, wait, everybody isn't making books in their room after school?
Yeah. And so did you think, and I don't mean to kind of, spend this whole conversation back in your childhood of
Right, right.
being a writer, but did you see that as a career, I guess? You know what I mean? Like, is that just like, oh, this is just what I'm doing when I grow up? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, so,
Like, were you conscious about that?
I would say the answer to that, as far as I can recall, I would say yes. So one of the things that I learned from my father was he loved his work. And he would sometimes he smoked a pipe, and sometimes he would sit around and contemplate. We lived in the suburbs of Washington D.C., and there were many sort of
Mm,
D.C. bureaucrats who were neighbors. The fathers and mothers worked for places like
mhm,
the EPA, and he would sometimes sit around and say, "I love my work so much. I don't understand why anybody would have a job that they just sort of went to while they were living for their weekend." And he would often,
mm,
when he came home from work at night, he worked for a newspaper called the National Observer. It was published by the Wall Street Journal. It
mm.
was actually kind of ahead of its time. It was a weekly um, sort of compendium of it was a compendium of the week's news, and
Oh,
it had a
interesting.
conservative bent to it. Yeah, one of his colleagues was Hunter S. Thompson.
Oh,
It was
wow.
yeah. If
Okay.
you look at the roster of people who work for the National Observer, it's dazzling. It's really dazzling. So they were onto something early. And so he would come home at night and he would say, "Boy, did I have fun at work today." And this idea that one's work
Mm,
was fun, and I talk to my students about this rather frequently, which is that we sometimes we get into our serious mind, and we kind of we leave the child's mind, and we no longer think that we're capable of or entitled to have fun with our work. But I've always had
mhm.
tremendous fun with my writing, and I encourage my students to think of it that way. I think our work as creatives needs to be centered on elements of the child mind and elements of play. And I think it's
Yeah.
in that playful association and joy that we really become highly generative thinkers, and we retain our ability to be speculative thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny to hear you say that. You're catching me at a very weird time in that I have been thinking about the difference in my creative process now than in my creative process when I was an undergrad student, and even my quote unquote creative process when I was a kid, and how much more free and wandering it was, and without any kind of fear. Uh, and now, even though it's my job and I'm known for it, it doesn't have that anymore. And because now I'm a known person, and there's certain things that feel like they're expected of me, or I'm a public person that needs to maintain a certain uh you know uh kind of branding element.
Hmm.
And I've been thinking that's my goal for 2020 is I want to return to that kind of just free making and that just kind of belief in the work and and putting that work out there, and some of it will stick and some of it doesn't, but it's okay. That fun freeing element is something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
No, that's really beautiful. This semester, Jarrett, I had Chip Lord of Ant Farm. He teaches with us. He came to
Yeah, yeah.
my graduate seminar and give a beautiful. He gave it this wonderful talk about his career. And the thing that really impressed me was how focused the talk was on the things that he loves, and how
Yeah.
he's loved cars since he was a
Mm,
young man, and he went through his whole obsession with cars and with car design, the features of cars that drew his eye.
mm,
And I looked
mm-hmm.
around the room and I watched my students, respond to this. And when you're in the presence of somebody who's deeply immersed in the things that they love and they're explaining it, there's a very particularized energy
Yeah.
you feel. I'm sure you've been at these kinds of talks.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then and
Yeah.
then what was so lovely is that as the talk was sort of concluding, he was saying how, given that we're in this climate catastrophe now, he really needed to shift his gaze away from his beloved cars towards trees, and he
Mm,
was developing the
mm,
same sort of warmth and feeling for trees that he had for once had for cars. Although he was also
right.
beautifully forgiving of himself for loving the car. It wasn't a scold. He just said,
Yeah.
basically, he said, as times change, we need to change, our thoughts with them. And I love that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so nice. And so like for you as this kid who's growing up with a father who loves his work and talks about how much he loves his work, and you are writing and are kind of loving this process, and then you're in school and you're studying political science, and this is kind of filtering into these things that you're thinking about, what comes after? What kind of jobs were you doing kind of immediately after undergrad? Were you writing kind of immediately?
No, actually, as even then, so this was, a long time ago, but even then, the way you got into a business like journalism was starting at the bottom. I mean, unless you had some really
Mm,
stellar
mm-hmm.
career at the Michigan Daily and got hired by the Chicago Tribune, and there'd be one or two people who had that path. You really had to go out and just start, making your way bit by bit. And so in those days, journalism was still thriving, and so the idea was you either went to a very small newspaper and started out reporting, a local beat like cops and courts, or
Right.
or you could
Right.
go to a larger urban newspaper and start very low on the ladder. In my case, because I was from the
Mm.
DC area, I moved back to DC, and I worked in the kind of typical things you do immediately when you're sort of scrambling. And then I was hired by a magazine, a national magazine called Saturday Review, and Saturday Review
Mm.
was being reinvigorated. Back in the mid-century, it had been like the weekly magazine that everybody read. It was the Saturday Review books. Then it
Mhm.
was a time when Book of the Month Club was huge. We were trying to bring it back. Our team, along the lines of like a Vanity Fair, and Vanity Fair was reinvigorating itself at the time too. And so there was this big sort of rush of these glossy, chatty, smart, kind of sexy magazines coming out. So we were trying to do that out of DC. What was funny about it was that the people who were running it really didn't know what they were doing. They had bought it and aspirations
Mhm.
for it. So then they hired an editorial team. They brought in an art director who they hired out of Texas Monthly, which was one of the hottest. And so in the magazine world, you refer to
Mm.
magazines as books. So Texas Monthly was one of the
Yeah.
hottest books at the time. So they got an art guy from there. They brought in writers who were also writing for Vogue and the New Yorker. And I was brought on as an assistant on the art side to help as help the art
Mm.
director. Basically, I think my title was assistant photo editor. And so
Okay.
I started out doing things like calling Annie Leibowitz's studio to get images from them. And at that time,
Wow.
it was cheaper to put me on an airplane and fly me up to New York to pick up films from these very famous photographers and fly me back than
Yeah.
to use FedEx. I
Wow.
know. It's just
Right.
something
That's amazing. I love
that
that.
was my life. And so it was quite dazzling, and it went, we bumped along that way, and then the magazine wasn't able to turn the corner, and it folded. And then I got picked up by the Washington Post, and they have a syndicate called the
Mm,
Writers Group, and they picked me up as an editorial assistant. And while I was doing these jobs,
okay.
I was also doing little freelance pieces for places, and I was beginning to cultivate my
Mm,
sense of what kind of writer I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to write
hmm.
books, but I also, I wasn't from a wealthy family. I had to have, I always had to have a day job, right? So then at the Post, though, that was a very important time in my career, even though it was a very it was a very functional job. The writers there were very kind, and they were very willing to share thoughts and insights, as were all the editors. And some of the writers who were there when I was
Hmm.
there, David Remnick was there on the style desk.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Ben Bradley was the editor, and Ben Bradley was the kind of person. So, so I was this sort of young woman who I imagined myself, moving abroad and having this big international reporting career, which I ultimately achieved. But that's like kind of another story. But I I would
Yeah.
read novels from the metro to my desk, and I had figured out a way to walk and read. So to
Mm,
double down on that habit, I was reading
yeah.
novels in French. And so
Okay.
one day I'm doing my reading in French thing, and I get on the elevator at the Post, and I never looked up because I was reading, and somebody started speaking to me in French. And I looked up, and it was Ben Bradley. And of
Mm.
course, I was very surprised that he was speaking to me, and he was speaking in French. And
Yeah.
he said to me, he was fascinated by this. And I told him a little bit about what I did and who I worked for at the Post. And I was in the newsroom delivering copy, pretty much every day. And he said to me, if you ever come by my office and I'm not on the phone and the door's open, there's nobody in there, pop your head in, and let's talk about where you want your career to go. And
Oh, wow.
that's an example of the real generosity that I found in these very, very creative and talented journalists. They were incredibly um, interested in helping young writers find their place. And it was through an editor at the Post that I got my job with the New York Times regional newspaper group out of Sarasota, Florida. And um,
Okay.
yeah, so what a lot of people, because this is inside baseball about journalism. So the New York Times has this group called NITRANG, and it's a training ground for many, many, many reporters who ultimately go on to other types of jobs at much bigger papers. And the editors are
Mm.
smart, and the papers are smart, and they win awards, and they really, really train you how to be an editor and a reporter. And that was where I really cut my teeth. They picked me up and shipped me off to Sarasota, Florida, where I was immediately editing one of the features sections that came out. I think it was the Wednesday section. So I went from being somebody who was walking around reading novels in French, aspiring to, have a real place
Right.
in the world of journalism, to showing up at my desk and, really just jumping in feet first. And that was dazzling. And it taught me so much about confidence and care and precision and accuracy.
How long did you do that before deciding that you were going to go back to school and get an MFA
Oh,
in writing? Because it sounds like you could have had a nice career continuing
yeah.
on that track, and it sounds like you were kind of doing a lot of the things you wanted to do. Why the change?
So journalism imploded. Journalism started, newspapers started cutting staff, not that long
Hmm.
after I was getting a lot of traction. The writing was on the proverbial
Mm.
wall. right? And so a lot of people, stuck with it. I ended up, moving abroad and reporting the news abroad for a couple of years, which had been my goal. I really wanted to live
Hmm.
outside the U.S. and do that. And then, when you're working, I was in a number of places, including the Antarctic, and some of them were freelance.
Right.
Some of them were freelance gigs. But then I also had stable gigs at in Bangkok. I was in Bangkok for over a year, reporting the news there.
Mm.
And when you're being an expat, there comes a time where you have to make a decision, which is you're either going to go all in on this and stay and become the sort of
Hmm.
human that expats become, or you're going to come back. And at that
Hmm.
time, I was 28, 29 years old, and I really did not want to live a life where I never went to another baseball game. And that probably sounds funny, but I'm a
Yeah.
huge fan of
Right.
baseball, and I just started thinking about, like, what kind of adult life did I wanna have? Like, I spent my 20s doing all
Right.
of this really sexy reporting and meeting all these dynamic people, and, I was really out there, and I just wanted to kind of reel it in, and I wanted to be a little more thoughtful about, what my next steps were. So I ended up moving to San Francisco and establishing a pretty robust freelance career because in those days you could live off freelance writing, and I loved
Hmm.
that. And that chugged along for a good while, and I ultimately became a mother. I have two sons. And I woke up one day, and at that point, I was running a magazine based in San Francisco. I was working about 65 hours a week, and I had my two young children, and I looked at my partner, and he and I were talking about our lives, and this was a really important moment for me, and I share this with my students a lot. I realized that I could continue doing what I was doing, living in my cottage in the Mission with my beautiful family, and I would never ever write a book because I didn't. Some
Mm.
people have that thing where they can come home at night after a long day and write their books. I don't
Hmm.
have that. I've
Yeah.
developed a little
Yeah.
more of that muscle over the years, but I am more of an introvert, and I need to recharge my
Mm.
batteries in order to get more deeply into my art, right? So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I decided to apply to the University of Iowa's nonfiction writing program, and they accepted me. And so we moved to Iowa very intentionally with the idea that it was going to be a 3 year space to get this book about the Antarctic into the world. And going back to
Hmm.
graduate school as an older student was really ecstatic for me because I remembered all the follies of my youth. I remembered the times I would
Right.
miss school
Right.
because I'd been tripping the night before. And I thought, I'm not going to be that person. I'm not going to be the one who stays
Right.
out, all weekend doing drugs so I can't go to class the next week.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I arrived at Iowa really sharp and ready to go. And Iowa so delivered on everything it promised. And I had the opportunity to take a lot of photography classes and geology classes and
Mm.
really immerse myself in that tasty R1 environment. And as the 3 years wrapped up, I had every intention of moving back to San Francisco. And my book was done enough that I knew I could finish it, when I got back. No, you don't
Hmm.
finish a book in graduate school. It's rare you do that. Much to
Yeah.
people's dismay when they start working on their MFA. No, you're not going to get your book done in 2 years. So yeah,
Right.
I mean, we all aspire to those things. Love it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I really had every intention of coming back here and doing that. And then one of my advisors suggested I apply for a Fulbright. And I did not think I would receive the Fulbright because Fulbright for me means really smart. And I think there are a lot of things I think about my brain, but I've never been somebody who sits around thinking, I'm one of the smart people. I think I'm one of the
Mm.
curious people. And I think I'm somebody who
Right.
really,
Yeah.
I will dog something till I get it done. Like I'm one of those people where if there's a hoop and you want to raise it higher and I need to get a bigger running start to get through the hoop, yes, I will do that.
Right. Yep. I know exactly what you mean.
I applied for the Fulbright and unbelievably I got it. So I my Fulbright was to go to New Zealand to pursue research. And this kind of toggles back to the idea of the research I was exposed to at the University of Michigan in the political science department. So I put
Mm-hmm.
together this
Mm-hmm.
highly interdisciplinary, really weird proposal about how objects from the Antarctic tell the story of a place very few people will ever visit, that doesn't appear on maps, that explores the erotics of the object and thinks about how we design our experiences around places we will never go, ecologies we will never see through stories. How do we tell those stories? And perhaps more importantly, who are the people who are entitled or get to tell those stories? So part of the underpinnings of the project was what are the lesser told or untold stories of the more simple people who go out into the world, and how can we hear them?
There must be something about San Francisco, because hearing you talk about being in San Francisco with your young family, and you could kind of see your whole career ahead of you and that you were never going to write a book, was exactly my experience when I lived in
Oh,
San
interesting.
Francisco. And it was like, oh, I have this good job, and I could see the like moving up the ladder at that job very clearly, and that it would have been like, this would be a fine life, and it's like all laid out, I can see it very clearly, and that is not what I want. And it was the same thing of I could come home and work on this other stuff, but it doesn't seem like I could actually do that yet. And so I also left San Francisco to go to grad school, um, for the same thing, to kind of try to figure
That's
that out. And so I
awesome.
thought that was so funny to hear you say that. It was the
Well,
exact same thing for me.
we're on similar paths, so you can completely understand that point of view.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Can you talk about? I found it so interesting you talking about those early kind of journalism jobs and how much you learned from those people who are mentoring you and kind of being in those different situations. What did you learn in the MFA program that then could add to this kind of writing education that you already were kind of getting at these other jobs? How did that kind of layer into it?
I think that's a great question. So at Iowa, I was surrounded by very talented and hard-working writers. And one of the things that I really drew from the experience of being with these hardworking writers was the very simple fact that creativity, acts of creativity, in the where you're trying to put your work out into the world, so there will be other people engaging with your work, is a type of blood sport. And it isn't a gentle, soft,
Mm,
and quiet place where we
hmm.
sit, in our, we stretch out on our divan with a certain cup of tea, thinking lost in our pensées. Instead, it's a discipline and a practice. And what they taught me at Iowa was how to have a creative practice. And they were very intentional
Mm,
in their teaching, both of craft but also in their teaching of how do we continue to generate work once we are no longer in the gilded cage, right? Once they open the door and you fly
yeah.
out, you go back to the world you came from, where, oh, by the way, nobody is waiting for your work. And many people will
Right.
revile you for for trying to make the work. And I
Hmm.
really say that
Hmm.
kiddingly
Hmm.
because people aren't even thinking about it enough to revile it. So, yeah, so I think that was the main thing I got. But also, one of the things I wanted to point to is that so I went to Iowa as a journalist with a very strong work ethic. So every night I would bathe, feed my children, bathe my children. They would go to bed at 8:15, 8:30, and then I would sit down at my steel case desk in my little room and I would write until 11. And I was very disciplined about that. And sometimes it was writing and sometimes it was
Mm,
reading, and I was also a teaching fellow there, so I was teaching undergraduates. But I I did
mm.
develop a particular discipline and habit, and that has that has never left me. I'm a very, very disciplined writer.
What you were saying about kind of this developing that practice, developing that discipline in graduate school, and then not just thinking about it as this is what I'm doing while I'm here, but this is what I need to keep doing after, I think is so interesting. And I cannot tell you how many people I have talked to either on the podcast, my friends who've gone to grad school, myself included, who have found their grad school experience to be so creatively and intellectually fulfilling. And then they leave and it's like back to the way it was
Yes.
before. And it was like that was a magical 2 years and now it's
Oh, and
gone.
now
So can you just talk a little bit more about how at Iowa they kind of talked about that, of kind of continuing that into the quote unquote
yeah,
real
so
world?
one of the things people are often surprised about is they'll ask me what's become of my classmates. So I was in the nonfiction writing program, but I had quite a bit of engagement with people who were in the writer's workshop, where they teach fiction and
Mm,
poetry.
mm-hmm.
And my partner at the time was a poet who, his dad and the poet who had graduated from the Iowa Writers Workshop, years before. And one of the things that we used to always
Mm,
discuss is how many people left Iowa and then went back to what they were doing before. They went back and were school teachers. They went back and
right.
they went back to the lives they had before they came to Iowa. And part of what I saw, and again, I think this goes back to being a slightly older student and being more hungry, wanting it more because I came out of the working world. I wanted to make sure I could accomplish the things as a creative person in spite of the facts and challenges that the day-to-day world was going to be sort of affecting on me. So I think my experience at
Mm,
Iowa
mm-hmm.
was I mean, while it was very lyrical and poetic, and I was introduced to all kinds of, craft thinking and art making, thinking about how graduate school is transformative was very much in the front of my mind, and I still teach that way
Right.
at because I teach graduate students and I talk to people, yeah, I talk to my students very
Mm-hmm.
explicitly about this, that we're making choices to have to have these practices. And if you waver from that
Mm,
choice, if you get distracted from the choice, and Jarrett, we live in times where distraction as a word is fascinating to look at, because think about what the center of that word is: traction, right? What does it mean to have
mm,
traction,
mm,
to be ambulatory, to be moving, and to be distracted from what you're
right.
doing? So we live in times where there are so many forces at work on our brains, that we really need to be we need to double down as artists and just say my art is more
Yeah.
important than these things that have been invented to make my life easier. And I say easier in quotes.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I know, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Can we talk
Sure.
about teaching a little bit? One of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is that you are a writer who teaches writing
Yes.
to designers. Um, and I am a designer who is interested in writing, who when I was in grad school took as many of the writing
Good for
classes as I
you.
could. And one of my great writing professors at Micah, where I went to grad school, was an architect who also was a writer. So he was still coming from it from a kind of design lens. And now I'm a designer who's teaching writing to designers in a graduate program here in New York. And I'm curious about your relationship to design, is coming from this from a writer first. Uh, I guess I have this is a two-part question. How did the word design or the world of design become a part of your life? And then how do you think about teaching writing to designers as opposed to
Right.
writing
That no,
to
that's a
writers?
great question. So as I mentioned, my background in making things comes from very much the work of the hand,
Hmm.
and so I I've always been an artist and a drawer, so I think about things visually, and I always have. As I said, my first book when I
Mm.
was 8 was an illustrated book, and I still paint and
Right.
draw, and and I think my sensibility about seeing the world comes to me through that work of the hand. But let's get to the heart of this question about the
Mm.
design aspect. So I worked at the magazine on the art side and thought about what does a story look like? What does it want to look like? So I had the opportunity very early in my career to think about what's the visual depiction of ideas. So that was already sort of a little bit of a spore in my brain.
Mm.
And
Hmm. Hmm.
when I was running the magazine here in San Francisco, I had an art director who worked for me. I hired somebody in from Scientific American. And so I was very involved in both the redesign of the magazine. I led the redesign of the magazine, and I worked with designers across all the years of running it, and was a very heavy-handed editor on the design side, thinking about how do people move across text in a magazine, how do we use different elements, what are the hierarchies. So I'm very familiar with all of the design elements because I've done it, right? And and so
Hmm.
when I
Hmm.
started teaching at California College of the Arts, I came in to teach a creative nonfiction workshop to the graduate students, and at that time the chair of the MFA design program is a very famous interaction designer named Brenda Laurel. So she did a lot of the early work with Atari. She did video games for girls long before people were thinking about those things.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
she's a genius, and she was a great mentor for me. And she had heard about my Antarctic work, and she was looking to rethink how writing was taught to graduate designers. At the time, she had a novelist who was teaching them,
Hmm.
and so she
Yeah.
came in and she'd read my Antarctic book. And if you look at that, you'll see there's a huge graphical element to how the words are presented. The first page of the book has one word on it, right?
Well, I mean, and even the way you were talking, that's why I was like thinking about this when you were talking about Antarctica, is because even when you were talking about it, you were saying that you were thinking about, the stories of these objects, which is, a designed artifact, and then who gets to tell this, that's
Right.
design writing. You're writing about design
Exactly.
still.
Right. I just didn't think to call myself that because I would
Right.
never. I'm I'm very careful about expertise. As
Mm-hmm.
a journalist, I I have expertise in areas. I have deep expertise in the environmental humanities around the Antarctic. However, I'm always a little bit, and this is my journalist mind. I'm always listening for people who are claiming certain types of expertise
Mm-hmm.
because I just listen
Yeah.
for that. So I
Yeah.
tend to have a more, for lack of a better word, I think a real self-imposed sense that humility is a better way to come at the world. And one doesn't need to name oneself to be something. One is something by
Mm-hmm.
doing it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've never lacked confidence that I bear the expertise around design. Although although I know people who have actual MFAs in design and who are graphic designers would not think of me as a, a peer in that space. I
Mm-hmm.
also know people who are in like furniture design and illustration design who very much think of me as a peer in that space. So
Oh,
it
interesting.
just it's sort of, yeah, it's just a matter of who the audience is,
Right.
who's receiving
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
signal.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
and interaction designers particularly have always embraced my way of thinking.
Mm.
And also in fashion design, they understand my way of thinking
Hmm.
about design. So Brenda invited me to design a design writing class, which what a beautiful gift. And I did, and it ran in the program for about, gosh, I guess about 6 or 7 years. And so the
Mm.
program is, has changed a bit now, and they teach writing from a very different standpoint. And I think it's a great one. When I was
Mm-hmm.
doing it, I the program started to grow, and I started working alongside a curator and design historian who's a very good friend of mine, Mara Holt-Scove, who writes about
Mm.
Heath ceramics, and she did a beautiful book called Manufactured with her late husband Stephen Holt, and she's done
Yeah,
many
I
of
think
them.
I know that book. That
Yes,
sounds
it's
familiar.
a
Yeah.
genius book, right? And they also did
Yeah.
they make up these portmanteau words like blobjects was one of their projects.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I know this.
So she and I started teaching together and came up with this system where we would divide the semester up and we would teach what we called arenas. So she would teach from the standpoint of a curator and design history, and I would teach from the side of the story. All great design is a story. It's just told with in
Hmm.
different ways. And I very much believe that if you can develop a design practice that has a tower of writing alongside it, the writing feeds the made work as the made work feeds the writing. And you learn your brain is exercising two very beautiful acts at the same time, which wouldn't happen if you were doing exclusively one or exclusively the other.
That's exactly. I agree with everything you just said, and that's kind of what I was curious about. Is kind of how you think about the intersection of those two, how they influence each other. And so for me, something that I often tell my students, whether I'm teaching them writing, and I'm hesitant now that you're talking about people claiming expertise. I do not necessarily think of myself as a writer, but I've fallen into teaching writing to designers somehow. Um, I tell them that I think the design process and the writing process are actually almost the same thing. Both design and writing are a way to form ideas and to give ideas form.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is a way to help you think and then to give that thinking a shape to then communicate with someone else. I think that's what writing does. I think that's also exactly what design does. And so being able to toggle between them can help you actually do each of them individually better.
Yes, no, that's absolutely perfectly articulated. One of the things that I found, and I'd be curious if you find this with your students as well, is that I'm teaching in fashion design now. I'm teaching
Mm,
them how to
mhm,
write statements and articulate what their work
mhm.
is. And one of the things I find is that a lot of people who are, students who are drawn to design have never had the opportunity to develop a writing practice. And
Yes.
many of them have been sort of categorized as people who are so called visual thinkers, or
Yes. Yes.
people who traffic more in the object or the idea in a certain form, but writing isn't their bag.
Right.
So
Mhm.
part of this, and I'm sure you find this as well, is to try to find sort of clever and sneaky ways to trick them into falling in love with writing. And so one of
Mhm.
the things I often encourage them to do, because so many of the kids now come out of school environments where they teach to a test, and they've had to do
Yes.
a lot of the creative work kind of secretly in their basements. And they
Mhm.
often are
Mhm.
writing these very sort of peanut butter and jelly sorts of essays and things like that.
Yep. Yep.
Haven't had much exposure to being creative writers, which is very different than my education, where I was encouraged to write creatively. So I get them writing from the first person. I have them
Mm.
reading the first person, and I have them thinking about what their position is on different things. So one of my favorite assignments that I've done with design writers is I have them think about robotics, and we look at both the history and the current state of robotics, not AI. It's about movement, not thinking. And then
Hmm.
I have them come on a hike with me in the Presidio and imagine how they would write a story of a robot that would be doing something to mediate human experience in that ecology. And
Oh,
then
wow.
they
Okay.
then they are to draw their robot and
Mhm.
name it, and some of them get so into it, they actually make models of their robot and sort of fall in love with their
Yep.
robot. So, as I said, it's sort of this quiet way to get them reading speculative fiction and thinking about
Mhm.
how do we use speculative thinking. in a pragmatic way. It puts them out in the world to be thinking about, what if I were to make something that were to exist here? What would it want to do? What would I want it to do?
Yeah.
And then, because it's not an actual thing, the stakes are lower for them. And I find they're ready to take much bigger um, risks with
Mhm.
narrating with power, using language with power and accuracy about what this thing, the intention of this thing is, what it does, how it functions, and why. Then we're getting back to sort of the
Yeah.
journalism piece, the who, what, when, where, why of it. And
Yeah.
and I know that there's a lot of writing that happens around art and design where it becomes highly theoretical, and there's a lot of referencing to people who lived in France in the middle of the 20th century, and and
Mhm.
and I'm not against those references, but I am an antagonist of that thinking. I do
Yeah.
challenge. First of all, as somebody who speaks and reads French, I always am curious about translations and how accurate the translation is.
Mhm.
I I I challenge how much one absorbs from reading fragments of very complicated literary theories, and also how
Mm.
much one understands it without the full scope and lineage of what each of those, and they were largely white men, were in
Mhm.
conversation with other thoughts about. So one of the books I often have my students look at is Terry Eagleton's little book on literary theory, because it's a
Oh,
very.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you ever teach that?
I no, but I love Terry Eagleton, and I have that
Yeah.
book somewhere around here. That's a great idea, actually.
It's marvelous because you can rocket through that book on a weekend, and you can then come in,
Yeah.
feeling. And it was given to me by one of my mentors at Iowa, because I was taking a PhD seminar on Whitman, and there was a lot of referencing to, all those blokes way back when.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I was really flummoxed by that. I said, why aren't we thinking more about Whitman? Why aren't we thinking? And so my lovely
Mhm.
teacher was ready to grab my dumb question, and he said, just read this little book on literary theory. He said, and oh, by the way, what's great about having you in the class is that you come to it as a creative nonfiction person and as a journalist, and your gaze and disposition on his work is towards his work as a journalist and how alive he was in the world. I mean, if you look at Whitman's poetry, and I read Whitman every day, still, and that
Mm.
was another thing that I derived from Iowa, is a love of reading poetry. So
Mm.
he Whitman's writing changed dramatically after the Civil War, and it changed. Maybe not dramatically, but it changes after the Civil War. And one of the reasons it changed after the Civil War is that he worked as a nurse during the Civil War. He
Right.
tended
Yeah.
the wounded bodies of men. And if you've watched either the Rick Burns Civil War or you've read anything about the Civil War, you know that the injuries that people sustained during that war were horrific. And the fixes for the injuries were even worse in many cases. They didn't have anesthesia. They weren't. They didn't understand about how germs spread, so people didn't wash their hands before performing surgeries. I mean, it was just this like hell on earth thing. And Whitman writes
Mhm.
about that, but he stuck with it. And so, back to your question. So, or just thinking about this theory piece. So while I appreciate that, and I loved what you and Jim Voorhees were talking about around theory, while I
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah, yeah.
how theory sparks lenses that would not be available to us had we not read these other people's thoughts, I I also really want to empower my students to learn to generate thoughts outside of that gilded cage.
And what I also think tends to happen is when you are first I see this with my students, and I was guilty of it when I was in their shoes also. When you learn these people and you feel like it's life changing, or it's like somehow that this has opened up a new way of thinking,
Hmm.
you then use them as a crutch to kind of uh prop up arguments, or to kind of like show off that you know these people, and it doesn't
Right.
actually add anything to the writing itself. It's just hey, look, I know who this person is and I know what they said about this. Where if you were to actually just kind of write without that, or
Mhm.
bringing in these other people, that it actually would make the writing itself more interesting, other than falling back on this as kind of like a kind of nudge nudge wink wink, I know these people, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yes, no, I completely agree with that. So one of the things I give, uh, I also give public talks about ecologies and this,
Hmm.
Ecopoesis movement. And I was in the Maldives this summer doing field research, and I had the opportunity to give a talk at Maldives National University, and about ecopoetics and the research I was doing about thinking about climate catastrophe, and how there are
Hmm.
better ways to think about it than we're all going to die in some grim apocalypse or start hunting and eating each other as zombies do. And so as I was pressing my arguments around these things, one of the towers I have to point to is this sort of high theory, this literary theory, because there's a lot of ecological thought that comes out of the gilded cage of scholarship, and they're just name checking people throughout their books in a way that I understand that's the parlance of the world they live in, but I don't necessarily feel like they're speaking to me and most other humans when they do it. And so they have to do that to get
Right.
through the metal detector of academia. I get that. They're going to be peer reviewed. They can't just, go on a big riff without referencing these, the people who came before them.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
However, and this is the part I think you'll love, what the analogy I use is that it's very much like um, the references you see in the music of like Biggie Smalls or
Mm.
Dre or Eminem, where it's this sort of straight out
Yeah.
Compton thing, where they have to name check everything about their neighborhood and their area down to their area code, so they can prove that they
Right.
authentically belong in that space.
Oh,
So
yeah, 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 yeah.
use that reference. I say, there's the straight out of Compton part of this conversation that comes out of my theory, and I think
That is a great way to think about that.
yeah, it's a place I've kind of settled, and it makes the most sense to me. And I'm not arguing at all that everybody should just be running around out of context. But I also think, given
Right,
that the
right.
context that's being offered is oftentimes a largely white male, highly patriarchal
Mhm,
and hierarchical view of the
mhm.
world that has no place for the female body and no place for people of color, nor does it interrogate, the gross insults that have been thrust upon the rest of us by those systems of, racism and misogyny and, economic terror. Then I really wonder in the 21st century, how do we point to those
Mhm.
things while also saying, and we've built a world that's completely unsustainable. We know that it's unsustainable on a planetary scale. And might we not now begin to talk about something away from this apocalyptic kind of, normcore dream that's being, thrust at us, and instead
Yeah,
say, if we can build and design this world that's led to climate catastrophe, we can also build and design a world that can exist within the limitation
right.
of the planet. Roland Barthes didn't think about that because he was thinking about the issues of his times. And if Roland was sitting here with me right now, I guarantee you he would be writing about things in a very different way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You brought up, ecologies and climate change, and that's kind of where I wanted to end this conversation, actually, because I've found that you use the word ecologies a lot to talk about your own work in your writing and in kind of a sort of pedagogical sense. And I think it's easy to think about ecology strictly as nature, environment, that sort of thing. But in the way you talk about it, it also seems like this kind of metaphor for a lot of this stuff that you're talking about, racism and misogyny, that these are all different types of ecologies. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that word ecologies and how that influences all of your work.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. So the reason I've pointed my my thinking towards the word ecologies, although I do use the word environment and I do use the word nature, but when I'm using those
Mm-hmm.
other words, I'm using them for very specific reasons. And so
Right.
let's start with the word nature. So nature is a term that humans created to define everything that's not us, that's in the world, that we haven't made. And it refers to, it points towards the fall. It points towards this idea that we're superior and not of this, that nature stands away from
Mm-hmm.
us. And it creates a relational identity to human life on the planet that is a big driver for the situation we're in right now, where the climate is catastrophically shifting. And so
Mm-hmm.
I find the word ecologies to be a place, it creates a thinking space for me where I can look at, in an interdisciplinary way, all the things that make up all the diverse ways things live on the planet. And those include, the social systems that we have created and we live within, and they include the things that actually are here. So let's talk a little bit about perceiver dependent and perceiver independent stories. So, if we agree
Mm-hmm.
that there are two types of stories, one is a perceiver dependent story and one is a perceiver independent. So let's start with an example of that. So if myself and a kitten are standing on Baker Beach near my home and looking out at the Pacific Ocean, neither of us can argue that it's not the Pacific Ocean. It is the Pacific Ocean. It exists as ocean. If instead the kitten and I get in a car and we drive up north 25 hours or whatever it is, we'll get to a point where there's going to be a group of humans with guns, and they're called Canadians, and they're going to be standing on something called a border. And a border is a perceiver dependent story. So we've all agreed to that story. And one of the things that happens when there's disagreement about these perceiver dependent stories is that things like borders shift, right? And in the biggest extreme of the
Mm-hmm.
perceiver dependent story shifting, we have revolution, right? Look at France in the 18th century.
Right.
So how do we have the language? How do we find language that has the most power and accuracy to describe the complexities of the times we're in now, where we really can't take out an individual thing like a hummingbird and just look at the hummingbird and say, oh, the hummingbirds are all dying now. The hummingbirds, the ecosystem doesn't support the hummingbirds the way it used to. I really do argue that the only way to fully understand the feelings of being in these times is to have integrated conversations where we're looking at the many different factors. And I want to also say there are many, many scholars around the world who have shifted towards this lens of ecologies and who define it in a similar way. One of the people whose work I'm really enjoying now is Joanna Zielinska, who wrote this really wonderful
Mm-hmm.
little book called, and it is literally a little book, although it's peer reviewed, called "The End of Man," and it's
Mm.
thinking about feminist post-apocalyptic vision. And she also made a beautiful little film to go with it called Exit Man. And what many of us are arguing around this language is that if we can't, let me make that more positive. What we need to do is be thinking about the stories we need to tell now in order to
Mm.
build that world that's going to be different than the world we're in now, because we need to build a world that we can sustain. And so market systems will,
Right.
many things will change. And then just to speak briefly about the word environment. So environment is also a little bit problematic, although I like it more than nature, because it's caught up in ideas of, I think, like environmental justice. Although environment and environmental justice are two
Mm.
sort of separate things, it does sort of again create this category that has humans in it more than nature does. But it also has this
Mm.
sense, to me, it has a feeling of management, and it also has this feeling of like a fight or a battle. And so I
Mm.
guess I like ecologies because it feels like it's beginning to get us thinking about, okay, I can't take the banana slug out of the conversation, nor can I take out of the conversation the trauma I feel on a daily basis when I look at the news and see things like these wildfires that are burning either 75 miles north of where I live or across the Pacific Ocean outside of Sydney. So we're
Mhm.
increasingly exposed to this low level and sometimes very high level trauma around, wait a minute, things are destabilizing.
I really like what you were talking about when you were talking about stories and how how reframing the way we talk about these things and talking about them in a more integrative way seems to be a path forward. My last question is you mentioned early on that as a kid you were a reader and a writer. You mentioned something that you learned from Iowa was appreciation of reading poetry that you still read every day. I kind of want to end with just what are you reading right now?
I am reading a genius book by Jedediah Purdy, who's an environmental legal scholar at Columbia, and it's called This
Mm.
Land is Our Land. And it's 200 pages long, and he makes the most beautiful, trackable arguments about many of the things we've talked about. I mean, I feel as though he's he and I have been we're just thinking about very very similar things, and he articulates it in because he's a legal scholar in just such a precise way, in a way that as a
Mm.
creative writer I don't often, I just don't think about things quite as, you know, in such a lockdown way.
Hmm.
I mean, he just makes beautiful, beautiful arguments. So I've been lost in that. I've also been enjoying Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, which
You're the second person to say that in like the last month. And it keeps coming up on my Amazon like recommended Amazon list. So I gotta buy this book.
yeah. And then there's a new book that's just out by a woman named Carmen Majado, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, so we probably should check that. But it's called In the Dream House, and she's recounting
Mm.
through a series. Each chapter is a different form. It's a memoir that's recounting being in a very violent relationship with and traumatic relationship with another woman while she was in graduate school at Iowa. And one of the things that I've
Mm.
been reading around quite a bit lately is around trauma and thinking about trauma, because I think this
Mm.
is, and you talk about a design challenge. I think and it's one of the reasons why I founded the Ecopoesis movement with those two architects, because we wanted to create a space for
Mhm.
people to come together and make work and write and talk around what our feelings are about different tactics we can have in regard to climate catastrophe. So I think you'll love this as a writer too.
Mhm.
We organize ourselves around words that begin with re. So at the first step we had
Mm.
in April, where we had 48 people, um, we divided everybody into three groups, and it was um, remain, resist, retreat, and everybody had to make a
Mm.
message around their word. And the messaging and the made work was lovely, but more importantly, about before we actually started making work, we spent about 2.5 hours doing those beautiful things where you just put lots of ideas on the wall around what the feelings
Mm.
of these
Mhm.
different conditions of things, because we all need to start thinking in a very focused way and then acting in a focused way about what are our actions going to be. How much are we going to try to resist, like the cities building seawalls? How much are we going to try to remain, like people who are arguing through the courts that they should be able to live in these beach areas where they're being very impacted by tides and things like that? And how much are we going to agree on this notion of retreat, that there become places that really cannot be inhabited in any way that's to our liking, and we need to retreat to other spaces,
Hmm.
because and retreat also, intellectually, from things like philosophically, like we need to retreat, as I've said, from this hellish apocalyptic thing that keeps coming up. I mean, we really need to stop thinking that the only thing we can all do is die. We need to get out more and love each other
Yeah.
more. We need to dance more. We need to go to listen to music. We need to remember that human culture is beautiful and
Mm.
adaptable, and so many fantastic things have been made by humans, and that if we focus on finding ways forward through redesigning the systems that are causing us to collapse,
Hmm.
we have a chance. We do have, as the song goes, one last
Yeah.
dance.
Leslie, I don't know about you, but I feel like that was like a perfect way
I
to
think we did.
wrap this up. This was such a great conversation. Thank you so
I
much
feel
for
like you're
being
my
on the
friend now.
podcast.
I feel like we're friends. I love it.
This episode was recorded on November 14th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.